Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the last plenary of our day. With a very provocative title, Neither Marketplace nor Battleground, Catholic Universities as a Field Hospital for a Better Kind of Politics. I'm Diane Steele. I serve as president of the University of St. Mary in Leavenworth, and I'm your moderator today. And we are very honored to have with us this afternoon as our speaker, Therese Lysaught, who is a professor of moral theology, healthcare ethics at the Nice Wagner Institute for Bioethics and Healthcare Leadership at Loyola University, Chicago. Her scholarly work brings into conversations field of theology, medicine, bioethics, and global health. Dr. Lysaught is the author of several publications and has received awards from the Catholic Press Association. She is the founding member and the current editor of the Journal of Moral Theology. In 2020, she was appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life. We'll reserve some time at the end of the keynote for questions and answers. Would you please join me in Dr. Therese Lysaught? Teresa?
Thank you, Sister Diane. And thank you all. It is a delight to be here today with you for my first ever meeting of the ACCU. Maybe it'll be the last after my talk, but it's my first meeting of the ACCU. Standing before this gathered expertise for a faculty member is a little intimidating. Looking at the content of the program, I wanted to go to almost every breakout. This really renews my hope for Catholic higher ed. And I'm really glad to be with you in person. So if the technology glitches, I can just shout, and you can hear me, and we can continue our session. After this morning's opening plenary, I went back to my room and I added a line to my talk. This is a footnote to Jeffrey Sachs. After the second plenary, I went back to my room and I crossed out that line and I changed it to say, my presentation is a footnote to Jeffrey Sachs, President Daniels, and President Haas. I want to thank Father Holtschneider for so savvily curating the three plenaries today. I think they really build on each other, and I hope that I'm going to be able to integrate the conversations we've been having today. I might say some things that we've heard before. I was saying this to Claire Noonan during one of the talks, and she said to me, given that this is a Catholic audience, she said, well, we should get a bingo card, and every time you say something that somebody else said, we could check off the little boxes. So let me begin. Legislation banning so-called divisive concepts concerning race, gender, sexuality, and U.S. history has been enacted in K-12 classrooms across a third of the U.S., and now pens for public colleges and universities in at least 7 states. Abortion services are now being offered on some college campuses, while others continue longstanding practices that create obstacles for pregnant students. We hear of efforts to dismantle DEI at public universities, accusations of Islamophobia versus academic freedom at others, gender disparities in student evaluations of faculty, struggles to teach about the Holocaust amid rising anti-Semitism, and more. These are just some of the headlines from Inside Higher Ed and the Chronicle of Higher Ed from just last week. As I'm sure you know from your experience, educational institutions from kindergarten to R1 universities have become one of the key battlegrounds in the culture wars. As fraught as these institutions can be at public institutions, for Catholic colleges and universities, they can be even more difficult to navigate due to how these same culture wars have infiltrated and are fracturing the church in the US. Catholics who largely agree on abortion as a moral question appear to be sharply divided about the new legal landscape post-Dobbs. Bishops are staking out starkly different positions on the issue of transgender, resulting in what Catholic healthcare ethicists have long referred to as, quote, geographic morality. Some Catholics have begun to grapple with the historical role of the Catholic Church in creating and sustaining the social construct of race, with an increasing number of religious orders in Catholic colleges and universities undertaking the difficult work of truth-telling and reparations with regard to their historical involvement in structural racism, while other Catholic voices loudly dismiss or denounce movements for racial justice as, quote, Marxist-inspired anti-Christian pseudo-religions. This afternoon, I want to invite us to take a step back from these frenzied headlines and the ways they shape the day-to-day realities of our institutions to ask, how did we get here? What is driving these culture wars, especially in the Catholic sphere? And given that we are Catholic colleges and universities, what resources might we bring to resist them, to rise to these times, not only for our own well-being, but to provide a different way forward for our communities and the national landscape? As a way into this question, I'm going to start with a story. This story, I suggest, resonates with our contemporary situation in key ways. It's a story I'm sure many of you know. It goes like this. Jesus went into a synagogue, and there was a man there who had a withered hand. And they were watching him to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath day, hoping for something to use against him. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Stand up out in the middle." Then he said to them, "Is it against the law on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they said nothing. Then, grieved to find them so obstinate, he looked angrily around at them and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was better. The Pharisees went out and at once began to plot with the Herodians against him, discussing how to destroy him. That this scene takes place in a synagogue is not accidental. At Jesus' time, the synagogue was an innovative, faith-centered institution that functioned as a school, as well as a hostel, a charity fund, a meeting place, and more for local Jewish communities. In other words, it was a space not unlike contemporary Catholic colleges and universities. So it should not be surprising that then, as now, such a space was a key site for the ancient Palestinian culture wars. What is more, the key players in this story, I will argue, bear an uncanny resemblance to key players in our own context. The religious traditionalists who have entered into an unholy alliance with contemporary Herodians. The man with the withered hand. And Jesus, who, standing at the center of the story, points a way forward for us, beyond rhetoric and tactics shaped by an imagination of war, but rather toward a vision of peace, healing, and the flourishing of persons, communities, and creation. Let's walk through each of these characters one by one. I begin with the unholy alliance. Before Jesus even walks into the synagogue, the stage has been set for confrontation. We are only in chapter 3 of Mark's gospel, but the war is already simmering. In chapter 2, Jesus has forgiven the paralytic's sins, eaten with tax collectors, refused to make his disciples fast, and plucked corn on the Sabbath. So now the religious traditionalists have laid a trap. And the teeth of that trap is the law. The way Mark depicts this scene, especially the way the religious traditionalists ally in the end with the Herodians, echoes Massimo Borghesi's incisive analysis of U.S. Catholicism, described in his recent book, Catholic Discordance. Borghesi argues that since the early 1990s, a new version of Catholic Americanism has emerged. It is comprised, he argues, of two pillars. The first pillar he calls a strident catho-capitalism. Proponents of this variant have refashioned the Catholic tradition as an apology for the economic theory of neoliberalism that we heard explained so clearly this morning by Jeffrey Sachs. Like the Herodians, who subordinated their Jewish faith in order to ally themselves with the Roman power structure, here Catholicism is used to advance a specific ideology. In our case, an ideology of the market and its particular understandings of the state, culture, and the human person. To do this requires a selective, partial, and quite distorted presentation of the Catholic tradition. Borghese dissects this in detail, and I encourage you to read his account. The second pillar of this new Catholic Americanism for Borghese is the culture warriors, those who appear on the surface to be religious traditionalists who, as he says, quote, take morality as their battleground. For most of the past 30 years, the culture warriors have sought to defend, quote, a specific set of values that were rejected by the dominant culture: unborn life, heterosexual marriage, the lives of the terminally ill. More recently, however, the battleground has expanded. According to University of Notre Dame political scientist Patrick Deneen, the culture warriors are no longer fighting specific issues. They are fighting what he calls, quote, a new biopolitical regime. This regime is run by those he calls, quote, the disembodied laptop class, or, quote, the virtuals, a, quote, woke, radicalized messianic party that is advancing its Gnostic vision amid the ruins of Christian civilization. This regime, he continues, is, quote, merely a new articulation of the revolutionary dream that was once vested in communism, that disdains the working class, and that recently sought, quote, to impose biopolitical dominion over all of human life during the suddenly irrelevant, air quote, crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. In other words, what was once a small handful of issues has exploded and is now deeply interwoven with race, class, gender, and geopolitics. Borghese argues that at heart, these two pillars fundamentally contravene each other. They have come together in a sort of unholy alliance, a pragmatic plot, we might say, between those championing the marketplace and those dug in on the battlefield. His claim is plausible, for if one accepts neoliberalism with its tenets of the radical freedom of the individual, the radical minimization of government, the relentless pursuit of economic efficiency, the elimination of mid-level or voluntary social organizations, including the church and schools, and the endless economization of everything, then the catho-capitalists should readily accept all those social practices that the culture warriors abhor. Abortion as a commodified service, especially for the full economization of women, the freedom of individuals to marry whomever they wish, the promotion of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia to eliminate non-productive persons, and so forth. These practices are in many ways a logical outcome of neoliberalism as an economic theory and a wider cultural ideology. The catho-capitalists should celebrate them, but they don't. They refuse to admit, Borghese argues, that the economic model that they endlessly champion is the real engine of these social practices. Instead, in what appears to be a deeply contradictory move, they align with the culture warriors, calling for active governmental intervention to prohibit a targeted but ever-widening field of social, moral, and educational practices. We find a similar internal contradiction amongst the culture warriors. This became clear to me in the summer of 2021, when some among the small but amplified minority of Catholics who opposed the COVID-19 vaccines stunningly began to use the mantra, "My body, my choice." Beyond being a moment of dark comedy, the language that was used by anti-vax Catholics was deeply neoliberal. For here we heard the same anthropology, a radically disconnected decision maker empowered to choose their own preferences based solely on their autonomy, now renamed a, quote, right to conscience. Echoing the neoliberal dogma of privatization, we heard the vaccination question described as, quote, a deeply personal issue. Following the neoliberal dogma of deregulation, these Catholics opposed any infringement on individual or corporate freedom, be it from local, state, or federal government, but also from any other organization, be it an employer, hospital, long-term care facility, school, diocese, magisterial body, or even the Pope. This opposition to the vaccines was rooted in the putative connection to two historical abortions. This concern might have been persuasive, except for the fact that many of the figures opposing the vaccines likewise opposed from the beginning almost every public effort to stem the virus's spread. As early as May 2020, Catholic dioceses began suing local municipalities about social distancing occupancy measures. Parents at Catholic schools, and even some Catholic schools themselves, protested mask mandates. All of this began well before the vaccines became available. In other words, well before any conscience-based concerns about abortion, the focus of the culture warriors was simply a neoliberal rejection of government's function of protecting the common good in favor of the putative freedom of atomized individuals camouflaged under the rhetoric of religious freedom. Thus, Catholic opposition to the COVID-19 measures has helped to make clear that at heart, these two seemingly contradictory pillars are simply two faces of the same neoliberal ideology that has increasingly pervaded the global landscape since 1980. This connection helps us to explain another deeply perplexing contradiction within this Catholic Americanism itself, that while its rhetoric is pro-life, their overall platform can often be quite anti-life. It also helps illuminate why this market warfare melange is particularly problematic for our work as Catholic colleges and universities. To plumb this more deeply, let's return to the man with the withered hand. Between Jesus and the religious traditionalists sitting on the margins of the synagogue is the man with a withered hand. He is a concrete, embodied person, probably a poor person, who has long been in need of a healing intervention. But the authoritative champions of tradition have no interest in healing him. Rather, across the synagogue invisibly stretches the law, a wire for Jesus to trip over as he moves to heal the man. Likewise, in the US for the past 40 years, the culture warriors have positioned the pro-life witness as a tripwire, separating the church from most policy efforts designed to assist those with withered hands. Although purporting to defend life from conception to natural death, those fighting the culture wars have focused on a narrow array of actions, almost exclusively laws, aimed at prohibiting a select set of issues. Traditionally, abortion, physician-assisted suicide, and gay marriage, a list that has, over the past 2 years, begun to expand to include contraception, gender-affirming medical care, DEI, and the teaching about structural racism. Yet here we run into another apparent contradiction. For while vocally claiming the pro-life high ground, Borghesi's Catholic Americanists often explicitly champion social practices that directly attack human life, the death penalty, for example, or war. They support draconian policies and practices against immigrant men, women, and children and families, practices that separate families, incarcerate them, and inflict bodily harm, both at our southern border and across the US landscape. More recently, they seem to support activism and legislative initiatives to deploy state or economic violence against those with whom they morally disagree, deputizing neighbors against each other, threatening to jail parents, criminalizing people's travel, firing K-12 teachers, revoking medical licenses, threatening hospitals, and sometimes suggesting the death penalty for women seeking abortions. At the same time, they strenuously resist social policies designed to protect human health, well-being, and life. Not only did many vocally pro-life Catholics stand unmoved as COVID killed now approximately 22 million people since February 2020, and that's probably an undercount. Prior to this, they had often lobbied against seemingly any issue designed to promote human life and well-being, expanding access to healthcare via the Affordable Care Act, addressing climate change, combating the real threats to life experienced daily by people of color, as we have seen yet again this month in Memphis, expanding social services to assist the elderly, people with disabilities, children, and the poor, reducing military spending, instituting reasonable gun control efforts, or advancing economic initiatives solidly aligned with Catholic teaching, such as living wages or unionization. This is the wire Joseph Cardinal Bernardine tripped over when he sought in the mid-1980s to reorient the Catholic witness by envisaging a different way forward, to bridge all of these issues under the umbrella of the consistent ethic of life, and to do so by building common ground. The vehemence of the backlash against his vision, especially from those within the Catholic Church, signaled clearly that something else was driving those who opposed him. With 30 years of hindsight, it is now easier to see that a key driving force behind this opposition has been neoliberal idolatry, as John Paul II called it. For more important than healing, promoting, preserving, and protecting the lives of real people and the common good are the iron laws of neoliberal economics: anti-government, anti-tax, anti-social spending, corporate freedom. In the most charitable reading, the Catholic Americanists are pro-life only as long as protecting human life and well-being doesn't require government spending or proactive social support. On a more wary reading, the rhetoric of pro-life has served to deflect attention from their deeper commitments to a nihilistic ideology that ruthlessly privileges economic profit and individual choice over human lives. A commitment to an economy, as Pope Francis has so rightly named it, that kills. That this neoliberalism in Catholic clothing is a deep distortion of the Catholic tradition is signaled by the image they deploy front and center: that of war. One of the most significant ways that they've done damage to the Church's witness, and thereby made our jobs more difficult, is by deploying the tactics of war. Let me just name a few. A first tactic is dehumanization. Opponents are labeled cultural aggressors, or as we saw with Deneen, woke, or the laptop class, or some version of the enemy. They are targeted, maligned, and demonized, often with mockery, insults, and vitriolic ad hominem. As Pope Francis notes in Fratelli Tutti, we hear, quote, verbal violence destructive of others with a lack of restraint that could not exist in physical contact without tearing us all apart. Here, the casualties are human persons and their dignity. A second tactic of war is deception. The culture warriors and Catholic capitalists incessantly misrepresent the Catholic tradition. As we see daily, they misrepresent opponents' positions, either via partial accounts or disinformation. They often falsely and blithely project their own actions onto their opponents, or, as in the recent case of George Santos, they simply lie. They make stuff up, confident that there will be no repercussions. Here, the casualty is truth. A third tactic of war is sophistry. This takes many forms. We hear a rejection or a distortion of science. We see assertion rather than careful, thorough, logical argument. Contra Thomas Aquinas, who had no problem learning from the pagan Aristotle or the Muslim Avicenna, with whom he disagreed on many points, one iota of difference with another's position renders it anathema wholesale. Or we hear emotivism, positions based on feelings, such as claims that vaccine objectors need not give reasons for their positions as long as they, quote, feel sure. As philosopher Alistair McIntyre notes, once we move to emotivism, where moral positions are reduced to preferences and feelings, the only way to resolve differences of opinion is by propaganda or force. Here, the casualty is reason. A fourth tactic of war is vice. Lost are prudence, temperance, charity, humility, mercy, hospitality. Gone is any evidence of the gifts or the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, kindness, generosity, self-control. In the comportment of the culture warriors and Catholic capitalists, one finds little that is discernibly Christian and a lot that is diametrically opposed. Here, the casualty is virtue. And a fifth tactic of war is the intentional targeting of human persons. Here, I think Michel Foucault's maxim comes alive: bodies are the site on which power is contested. It is on the bodies of real people that these issues continue to be fought. bodies like the man with the withered hand, throwaway bodies, as Pope Francis has so rightly named them. Here, the casualties are mostly those on the margins. The dignity of human persons, truth, reason, virtue, those on the margins, these commitments are the heart of Catholic colleges and universities. Thus, the culture warriors and catho-capitalists particularly undercut the goods central to our work. Certainly, as Pope Francis says in Fratelli Tutti, all this calls for an alternative way of thinking. If the Catholic tradition has been distorted by a war grounded in an idolatry to an economy that kills, one that is playing itself out on our very campuses, might the alternative be peace? A peace rooted in a very different economy. To explore this, let's return to the synagogue. Jesus calls to the man with the withered hand and invites him to stand up in the middle of the assembly. He seeks to dialogue with the religious traditionalists on their own terms, inviting them to a public discussion of the law. They refused to respond because this wasn't about truth. This wasn't about living the law. It was simply about power. With the law, God's gift for the flourishing of God's people, serving as a weapon. Jesus is aggrieved and angry. Like the idols they worship, they have become like stones. He turns to the man and again invites him. Stretch out your hand. And the man does. He responds to Jesus. And in this encounter, the man is healed. Here is the alternative. The encounter between the body of a marginalized person and the body of God incarnate. This encounter is the center of this story. It takes place at the center of the religious community. Two bodies come together, and indeed, here in this bodily encounter, power is contested. Jesus' radically different, life-giving power squares off against the death-dealing power of idolatry. And his power is greater. The man is healed and freed. To provide a detailed account of how this passage provides an alternative way forward for Catholic colleges and universities would require an extended theological treatise. Instead, I want to point to an example of someone who models this radically different alternative, namely Pope Francis. Like Catholic campuses, the Vatican has certainly become a battlefield, with the battles being waged in large part by these Catholic Americanists and their European franchisees that Borghese describes. And a key reason Pope Francis has been targeted is that he, like Jesus, has called out the problem. He has challenged their alliance to neoliberalism. But he also provides an alternative. How so? Return with me to March 28, 2013. Holy Thursday, a mere 2 weeks after the conclave. Pope Francis, as many of you may remember, even if you're not Catholic, knelt before a dozen prisoners, some Muslims, some women, and washed their feet. Year after year, he repeats this with a different group of marginalized people, performing the practice that stands in for the Last Supper in John's Gospel, tenderly, individually, and sacramentally, washing, drying, and kissing their feet. Move ahead to July 2013. On his first pastoral visit as Pope, Francis visited the tiny island of Lampedusa. Face to face, hand to hand, he stood surrounded by throngs of refugees, men, women, and children who had survived the perilous sea crossing, who had lost not only home and life savings, but friends and family members, both at home and in the unforgiving waters. He looked at them, touched them, listened to them, laughed with them, cried with them. And then together they moved to an open-air mass where he commemorated the thousands of migrants who had died en route. Fast forward to August 2021, where the culture warriors and Catholic-capitalists were wielding their interpretation of the law as an instrument of death. Pope Francis declared over and over in a video that went viral that to be vaccinated against COVID-19, and importantly, to bring the vaccines to all the peoples of the world, particularly the poorest, was actually, quote, an act of love. I could cite many more examples, but let me trace the key features of these three. In the COVID-19 vaccine video, Pope Francis, amplifying Thomas Aquinas, makes clear that at the center of Catholic moral discernment and the Christian life lies a different economy, the virtue of caritas, charity, the practice of self-gift or self-emptying love for the good of others. This economy does not derive from some philosophical account of human nature, whether from Friedrich Hayek or even natural law. Rather, it is revealed in what theologians even call the economic trinity, in God incarnate in Christ via the supreme act of self-gift, namely kenosis, or self-emptying. In this act, the Trinity's essence of love reached to the farthest periphery from God's divine self, namely us, taking on our human nature and showing via Jesus' life the fullest image of what it means to be a human person. But God's kenotic self-gift did not stop there. As the Gospels proclaim, God in Christ did not simply assume human nature, but pressed through to the farthest peripheries of human existence, per Matthew 25, to the bodies and lives of the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, the sick, the poor, the weeping, all the way to the cross, all the way to death. And God's kenotic self-gift does not stop there. God in Christ presses further to each and every one of us, offering gratuitously to engraft us into God's very self, so that we can embody Christ's living presence in the world. The place of this transformative encounter is, for Catholics, the sacraments. Through baptism, or so we say, we become members of Christ's kenotic healing body. This identity, this reality is reaffirmed, renewed, and deepened each time God in Christ encounters us in the Eucharist. There, in the words of St. Augustine and Benedict XVI, quote, we become what we consume. In the Eucharist, we are again and again and again encountered by the Trinitarian God who is love, caritas, self-gift, via Christ's endlessly self-emptying body. And we are thereby enabled to go forth into the world, bringing Christ's healing and reconciling love near to those on the peripheries. But even then, God's kenotic caritas isn't done with us yet. For as we move out into the world from the Eucharist, individually as missionary disciples in Pope Francis's new phrase, and corporately as the body of Christ, a missionary church, we not only bring Christ, we are encountered by Christ again. Christ who is present in the sick, the hungry, the thirsty, the lame, the bereft, the poor, the imprisoned, all those on the world's peripheries. As a place where we meet Christ, those on the peripheries become a sacramental locus. Of course, I'm not getting all of this from the Holy Father's 2-minute commentary in the video on the COVID-19 vaccines, but rather from the wider corpus of his writings and his witness. From Aparecida through Lumen Fide, Laudato Si, Samaritanus Bonus, to Fratelli Tutti, we hear a polarity that moves continuously back and forth between two sacramental locations, the Eucharist and the peripheries. In the work of Pope Francis, we find a dynamic of Catholic identity that moves recursively from sacrament to sacrament and back again. Or we could say from Christ to Christ and back again. Or we could say that the heart of Catholic identity is to be those agents, whether as individuals or institutions, where Christ encounters Christ in the recursive dynamic of Trinitarian love. Now, how does one preach this to the world without pedantically orating a theological treatise that most people couldn't understand? You perform it. And that, I would suggest, is what Pope Francis did at Lampedusa. That is what he does every year on Holy Thursday. Here he physically, tangibly brings Christ to Christ, enveloping Christ's presence on the peripheries within Christ's sacramental presence in the Eucharist. Here, as in the synagogue, two bodies come together. The body of a person who is broken, withered, hurt, invisibly relegated to the margins, and Christ's Eucharistic body. Again and again, Pope Francis brings these two together, creates an encounter between these two bodies, unleashing God's extraordinary healing power, both for those individual people as well as for those who see it. In these gestures, he provides not only an exemplary Christian witness and a refreshingly different model for Catholic leaders, he also performs a new vision for the church, captured in his metaphor of the church as a field hospital. As you may recall, in his first major interview as Pope in 2013, Anthony Spadaro asked him, "What kind of church do you dream of?" He responded, "I see clearly that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. Heal the wounds, and you have to start from the ground up." If we had more time, I would outline how Pope Francis's vision of the church as a field hospital is simply the vision of the Second Vatican Council. But what he also helps us see is that the vector of this work is not unidirectional. As the church goes forth into the world as a field hospital, it does not simply bring Christ's healing grace, it meets Christ's healing grace in those that it encounters on the peripheries. And in so doing, the Spirit recursively remakes, renews, and perhaps even converts the church. And likewise, even our Catholic colleges and universities. So to close, like Jesus in the synagogue, Pope Francis has unmasked the nihilistic idol at the center of this deadly variant of Catholic Americanism. And he doesn't pretend that there are no battles, that those who resist them or unmask them might not sometimes pay the price. We know how the gospel passage ends. Jesus tripped the wire. And, quote, "The Pharisees went out and at once began to plot with the Herodians against him, discussing how to destroy him." In the end, Jesus was crucified. But we also confess that Jesus was raised and is truly present in his body, the church, and Catholic colleges and universities are part of this church. If so, what might it mean for us to understand our institutions not as a battlefield or a marketplace, or worse, the intertwining of the two, but rather as a field hospital? Whose wounds are we called to heal? Again, the implications here are vast, so let me close by pointing to three. First, we are called to heal the wounds inflicted by both neoliberalism and the culture wars on those on our own campuses. Take, for example, our students. As the metaphor of the marketplace pervades more and more of our culture, young people are being taught to see themselves as, quote, enterprise units, who must, like little corporations, compete against each other, maximizing their efficiency, maximizing their productivity and profit, currying and protecting their brand. Like they talk like this now. Many have begun to argue that this economized understanding of the human person is a key cause fueling the ever-increasing crisis of student mental health. We, as Catholic institutions, can offer our students a different understanding of who we are as persons, interdependent, those who have endlessly received gifts, both from God and from others, and so who are then called to practice first an economy of gift and solidarity, who live in communion and accompany others even when, or especially when, it's not efficient. Such an understanding must be made real in the structures and practices of our institutions. Do we treat faculty and staff as neoliberalized drones, as human capital, whoever came up with that phrase, to be outsourced or downsized or rendered contingent following economic dogmas? Or do we approach them with cura personalis, drawing on the wisdom of the Catholic social tradition? As the marketplace and its logic increasingly shape our campuses, the way we form students, imagine the faculty, understand pedagogy, are we unwittingly inflicting harm on our students, our faculty, our contingent faculty, whoever came up with that phrase, our staffs, ourselves? For those interested in exploring this question further, I recommend Gerald Byers' Just Universities, Catholic Social Teaching Confronts Corporatized Higher Ed. Second, we are called to help heal our civil discourse by providing an alternative to trends in public rhetoric. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis called for a better kind of politics, a politics rooted in charity, in love, that prioritizes and seeks peace and human flourishing through openness, dialogue, and interpersonal encounter. He outlines what it might look like for the usual political actors. I would suggest that this better kind of politics must start with Catholic colleges and universities as a key ministry of the Church. Our unique charge is to be places where students learn the intellectual virtues, prudence, understanding, scientific knowledge, wisdom, openness, curiosity, craftsmanship, and reason, all dedicated to the search for truth, enhanced by the broader range of Christian practices: dialogue, listening, friendship, humility, hospitality. As a field hospital, Catholic colleges and universities are ideally places where students see these virtues practiced by and among the faculty, staff, and administrators, and learn to practice them within and beyond the classroom. These practices, deeply at odds with the behaviors of both warriors and marketeers, are a first and necessary step toward a long-term healing of our social fabric. Where else does this, or where else can this, happen? And thirdly, we are called to heal those on the peripheries. At the beginning of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis speaks of St. Francis and notes, quote, "Wherever he went, he sowed seeds of peace and walked alongside the poor, the abandoned, the infirm, the outcast, the least of his brothers and sisters." As the encyclical unfolds, he moves from the image of St. Francis to that of the Good Samaritan, another figure who ministers to one robbed, beaten, and left by the side of the road. I would suggest that the economic crime in this parable is also not accidental. Catholic universities are indeed called to minister to those left by the side of the road. Now, I have heard the rejoinder to this before: we are a university, not a social service agency. And I have a long answer to that. But in the short term, we might ask how the image of the field hospital helps us to think differently about our role in healing the long-standing economic wounds that continue to fracture our society and harm real people. We can certainly do this via faculty research on these various questions, via pedagogical methods like participatory action research that partners students in our universities with community organizations for real social change, via organizational practices that create a culture of inclusion and belonging that help to welcome and retain a diverse community of faculty, staff, and students that over time will help to repair the personal and economic harms rooted in centuries of exclusion. These are just three ways that Catholic colleges and universities might live their identity as part of a church that is a field hospital. We could certainly probe more, but for today, let me close by saying this, not catho-capitalism or culture warfare, is the heart of the Catholic tradition. This is the heart of Catholic identity. So I invite us to ask ourselves, which image will form our imaginations going forward? Are our institutions battlegrounds? Are we marketplaces? Or are we field hospitals, pioneering new possibilities for higher ed, possibilities drawn from an authentic understanding of our mission and identity, as spaces empowered by the grace of Christ to heal the wounds of the world, starting, as I think Richard Haas said, from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
You're welcome, thank you.
This time of day to be so inspired, and nobody fell asleep. You speak to the heart of the matter for us. We've heard it today earlier about Catholic social teaching in our economy. We heard it about the call to be part of the democratic fabric. And probably the part that it comes more naturally to us is to be the field hospital. How could you help us learn to dialogue with the culture warriors in a language to de-escalate it from war to at least détente?
Yeah. Well, détente's halfway. I don't know that's our goal, but that is halfway. I mean, that's a really good question, and that, obviously a long answer. And the question is praxis, right? And again, Pope Francis, I want to kind of think about, how does he model this for us? And he starts with encounter, right? I mean, a lot of this conversation happens with no encounter, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of culture warriors don't want to meet you face to face, right? They don't want to get in the same room, right? Warriors don't like to do that. So how do we create spaces where we invite, where we make the encounter, right? And Pope Francis doesn't say that this is any sort of like magic recipe, cause and effect, right? That if you have an encounter, that's going to change everything, right? You might end up getting crucified, in this encounter. But I think that's the first step, right? Creating spaces of encounter where, somebody was mentioning it earlier today, I think, that studies show that if you do this, it does diffuse the tensions, right? It's much more difficult to demonize a person if they're sitting in front of you, right? So that itself begins to change how people practice. So how can we create those conversations on campus, these places of encounter on campus? How can we moderate them and facilitate them? But also sort of shape them according to, we're a Catholic campus. What are our virtues, right? What are the virtues of an encounter, of a conversation? What are Christian practices, right? What does hospitality look like?
And civility.
And civility. We have like civic virtues. Nothing against civic virtues. I like civic virtues. But Catholics have an opportunity to deepen those even, right? I mean, hopefully if we're Catholics, we're civil.
We hope.
Right? But what does it mean to practice hospitality? Inviting you as a guest into my house, perhaps, right? I perceive you you're coming into my house as a guest. How does that change our relationship, right? We're not strangers anymore, right? We're going to share a meal, right? And how does this not contravene notions of perhaps civility, but how does it deepen them, thicken them, right? And make them even more productive?
Exactly. You feed right into that sense that once somebody has a name,
right?
As you talked about how it's easy to the this and the Democrats, but once they have a name and a face, then the encounter with the other Christ, the God within me recognizes the God within you. Right. The power of that encounter.
And it's somewhat kenotic for us who don't think of ourselves as culture warriors, right? Because we also have to self-empty, right?
Yes.
I have to say, well, maybe there's something I'm going to learn in this encounter, right? Maybe I won't demonize you the way I actually kind of do because I think you're a culture warrior. What might I have to learn from you? How might I have to sort of reshape some of my own practices, my barriers, my walls, right? So this goes both directions.
We're both in the middle of it.